got a degree from Arkansas Tech in Parks Administration. And I had originally gone there because I thought I wanted to be a coach, but after one year, actually less than that, I had decided I didn't want any part of organized sports for a career, and I'm really thankful that that happened. But Arkansas Tech had the only Parks Administration degree program in the state, so I switched over to that, and I liked it real well. And during the summer months when school was out, I actually got a job at Pea Ridge National Military Park. And so I got some really good experience. First summer there, I was a janitor and then a maintenance man and then a park interpreter for a couple of years. And so I really knew a lot about the Civil War and a Civil War battlefield and how those ought to be managed and what the purpose of them was and all those kind of things. So I wanted to get a job with the National Park Service, but it didn't look like that was going to happen at that time. And so a park ranger job opened up at Lake Dardanelle, and I interviewed for it and got that job. And it actually only worked there 3 weeks when I stopped by Prairie Grove Battlefield, since I was working for state parks and it was a state park. And the lady at the information desk said, well, the park superintendent here is retiring here in the next couple of weeks. And we had kind of hit it off in our visiting and everything. She said, you just ought to apply for that. And so anyway, it put a thought in my head about that. And a lot of odd circumstances came about, but I did end up applying for it. And because I was the only person that applied that actually had some experience and knew something about Civil War battlefields, I was able to get the job. Benny Morris was the park superintendent here, and he was apparently just really into law enforcement, and he kept the rules and didn't really have much interest in what the purpose of the park or any of those kind of things were about, apparently, but he did, he kept patrols good and, kept order and all those kind of things. But I just briefly met him, but the person at the information desk was Flora Bond. And she is a native of this area and had worked at the park for quite a few years and at the information desk, and she knew everybody in town and everything. And so anyway, I think in her mind, and she was right about it, that my wife and I would be a really good fit for Prairie Grove, because I had grown up small town Arkansas, north of Bearville, went to school at Bearville. In fact, Bearville played Prairie Grove in football, and even though I didn't know many of them personally, I did know them from remembering their names from when we played football and stuff with them. In fact, David Parks, I did know him because he also went to Arkansas Tech for a couple of years. And so I knew David and was familiar with several other people in Prairie Grove. And we just fell in love with the town here. Well, we moved up, and it came the end of December in 1977. And we hadn't any more than got here and gotten the keys to the house we were going to move in, because we moved into park housing, when Madge McQuestion shows up, and she has pie from the Colonial Restaurant that's just across the street, which is really, Irma made really good pies, pretty famous for that. She had pie and she had meat sandwiches, ham sandwiches from the Ozark Mountain Smokehouse, and just welcomed us from the start and was just so nice. And and everybody was that way. Bill Ramsey, because they had some difficult experiences because of the kind of enforcement type nature of the superintendent before me, and they didn't want to get off on the wrong foot for sure. So Bill Ramsey, who was a state representative, got me and took me the first week I was here to a Prairie Grove Lions Club meeting, and the Lions Club just, again, bent over backwards to be nice to me and make me feel welcome. And Prairie Grove was such a small and good community then everywhere we went, because we were new folks in a small town. Everybody knew us and welcomed us, and you know, a guy, Curtis Ray, I believe was his name, with a flower shop, brought us some flowers up. He said we didn't really have a welcome wagon, but he wanted to be that, and welcomed us. And people, you know, at the post office, it was just incredible how nice everyone was to us, and we knew that we had landed in a good place. And that is one of the reasons that my park career really started and ended here, because we had a lot of opportunities to move on to some bigger parks with more responsibilities and more pay and everything. But my wife and I knew that, you know, we were gonna raise a family. We were gonna have kids and things, and we thought we'd be crazy to leave this place. You know, it has good schools and good churches and nicest people you'd ever want to run into. It was situated so well in that, you know, even though Prairie Grove was a small town, it's close enough to Fayetteville. I mean, you could do anything in the world you wanted to do in Fayetteville, it seemed like to us. So we thought then, just like we do now, you know, this is really an ideal place to live. And so, you know, that was the end of my moving on, climbing the ladder in the park business or anything, because we knew we had a good thing going here, and it was a wise choice. I wouldn't trade it for anything. Well, when we got here, and and before I interviewed actually for the Prairie Grove Park job, I came and toured the place, and so I looked it over, and of course I'd had some, in my 4 years with the National Park Service, I'd had some good training. I mean, they had shipped me to their training center and everything, because I was planning on a career with them. And so I kind of knew how Civil War battlefields ran, that there was pretty much one theme generally that you tried to focus on, and you know, there was a mission statement. This is what we're trying to do. This is the story that we're trying to tell, that sort of thing. And I didn't see any of that really at Prairie Grove here, because there was a Civil War battle. You know, at that time, and a lot of people remember it, there were some World War I artillery pieces of equipment here, and some World War II pieces of equipment, some big self-propelled guns. I remember going into the museum, and there was pretty much anything that anybody thought was old was in the museum. There was dinosaur bones in it, all kinds of, you know, old refrigerators in some of the park, you know, the community buildings here that are showing the Ozarks supposedly. There was a, you know, a deer park, a deer pen, you know, which was all real fine, but it really didn't have anything to do and didn't help you understand the Civil War. And so I knew that a lot of those things needed to be changed over, needed to be converted to tell a better story. And one of the ways I would use to convince people of that, because there was a little bit of a community resistance in some ways to making some changes. Like, you know, everybody loved those deer. They didn't want the deer pen gone. Kids loved playing on those tanks, you know, as they called them. They didn't want those things gone. But school groups, which education was a big part of what we were trying to do. Part of our mission was to help people to understand and have an appreciation of the Civil War. And school kids would see those self-propelled guns, those tanks, and they would want to know now which side had those, or did both, or you know, how far could those things shoot. They absolutely had no sense that, you know, that wasn't going on during the Civil War. It confused people. It confused adults even. And so you know, I set out to try to give the park a little bit more cohesion in its message and direction, and that was kind of the bottom line of what I was trying to do. And some of it was appreciated, but it took a long while to get people to understand that, because more than anything, the city of Prairie Grove saw the park as just a recreational area, and they wanted a swimming pool and they wanted camping and those kind of things, but you don't typically have any of those kind of things at a Civil War era park. And again, and I think that message, now that quite a few years have gone by, people can see the value of that, because Prairie Grove attracts people from all over the nation because they know it's a good quality Civil War park, and they'll visit. They'll go out of their way to visit those places. You know, not just come to have a picnic and some fun and go for a swim or something. So, and one of the things that we have found out that needed to happen was there was not really enough area of the actual battlefield for people to get an idea of how big it was. And for example, the only park here that most people saw was approximately 10 acres, which the United Daughters of the Confederacy had initially bought so that the old veterans would always have a place to get together and have their reunions. And so that was essentially all people that came in saw as a park. And when they would ask about the battle, many again assumed the battle took place on just this small little 10-acre area, or the park owned 65 acres at that time, but none of it was accessible or anything. And so they had no idea of the size of a Civil War battle, and to try to explain that from the perspective of just this tiny little area and these few houses that are here was pretty hard to do, because so anyway, one of the initial ideas was that the area around Prairie Grove battlefield is essentially like it was at the time of the battle. I mean, it was farmland, but there was nothing to tell you about, oh yeah, they crossed the river, you know, half a mile from here, or the headquarters was at the Prairie Grove Church, Prairie Grove Presbyterian Church, that's downtown, and you just couldn't explain all that from this tiny little area. So that was the reason behind getting the extra land, was first of all to preserve it so it wouldn't grow up and just become a housing area or anything like that, but also to give a better idea. Because, for example, in the Battle of Prairie Grove, you got about 25,000 soldiers involved. Well, you don't get 25,000 soldiers and horses and cannons and all the wagons. That doesn't happen in a tiny little area. And the battle line was about 1.5 miles long, you know, across this Prairie Grove Ridge. And, you know, you've got to be able to see how big that is. And so, you know, we got the land to preserve it. And so you could better tell what the battle was actually like. And that's, in modern historic preservation, that's kind of a big idea that's necessary. And one of the ways to illustrate that, if you've ever been to the Alamo in Texas and San Antonio, you know, you've probably seen movies and things about that, and you just have an imagination of this little mission, you know, way out in the desert Southwest, you know, and the big battle that took place there. Well, if you've ever been to it, the Alamo's right in the middle of San Antonio. It's just right, there's just big buildings and everything around, and you really can't get a good picture of what that was like because it doesn't have any of the situation around it like it did at the time. And that's what an effort was going to be made to preserve enough of the battlefield that we could actually do a good job of interpreting it and telling about the battle. That was a tough time, and it was, as you said, because of the Gettysburg battlefield. That there was a part that was about to be bought up. I mean, it was about to be developed by a city, and people wanted to preserve that. And so at the last minute, they brought in the federal government to buy this section of the battlefield and paid an enormous amount for it in order to preserve it. Well, the National Park Service had the initiative to say, hey, all of you state governments that are preserving battlefields, don't make the mistake we've made by waiting until it's really threatened, till we're going to lose it, but be assertive and take some action on the front end of buying the part of the battlefield that you need in order to preserve it. So you don't have to buy tons of houses and different things like that to go along with it. So anyway, there were public hearings, at least a couple of them held, and it was at kind of a bad time, I think, just in the mood of the public at that time. It was a little bit anti-government, and so there was a local radio station that some people started using that forum to talk about taking back Arkansas and not letting the government come in here, and Prairie Grove is big enough, doesn't need anything else. And so there were, as much as the park department tried to squelch that idea that we're going to come in, the word they were using, and steal people's land, that didn't happen, and it wasn't going to happen, because state parks had said from the beginning that they were going to buy this land without it using eminent domain, even though the state government has that power to use that, but they were not going to do that. And so that was never a threat, but there were still people that had bad feelings toward the park buying up the land. But there were several good community leaders, and don't want to leave any of them out, but they saw the vision, and Boyce Davis was one of those, that for a small town like Prairie Grove, having a first-class preserved battlefield would be a real draw for our city, and be something that would, as far as tourism, always bring people in and provide a lot of value to the city. So Lloyd Swope, David Parks, Boyce Davis, Ron Stinchcomb, and I'm probably leaving somebody else out, but anyway, formed Friends of Prairie Grove Battlefield to start to raise some money to actually buy some of these lands. And when that happened, the way that really worked, from somebody who was watching the whole thing, that gave initiative to the state to say, hey, there's local support for this. There may be resistance, but there's local support for this too. So the state started being able to put some money in on it, and even we got some federal money in on it to start making some of the purchases around that needed to be bought in order to preserve the battlefield. And I think it's probably now, about 800 acres or something like that, which is the people who are real Civil War purists would want more than that, and but it's a pretty reasonable amount, because as time goes on, there's a driving tour now, and that can be improved, and there can be walking areas, and it still is used for farmland just like it was during the Civil War. So there's some real ideal things happening here at Prairie Grove Battlefield because of taking those steps quite a few years ago. I didn't ever know Fred McQuistion, but I knew his wife Madge. Fred, I believe, was a New Yorker, but and I'm not even certain right this moment how he ended up here, but he saw the value of preserving history, but especially preserving culture, arts and crafts, and those kind of things were what he was interested in. And he saw a lot of the old pioneer buildings around that were Civil War era, and the need to preserve those things, and thought that the best way to do that would be to actually bring those things to Prairie Grove Battlefield, to actually move those houses and get them here where they could be preserved. And so that was that was his idea, and he, I think, influenced the Prairie Grove Lions Club to get involved with some of the work in moving those things, and got Virgil Couch to do a lot of that. They brought in and mostly all the buildings that are here, they did have some kind of connection with the Civil War and the Battle of Prairie Grove. Even like the monument that we have is the smokestack from a mill at Ray's Mill, and that was a critical point during the Battle of Prairie Grove on determining the approach site for the armies to come in. And you know, the Morrow House was on an important junction. So they've all got a connection with the Battle of Prairie Grove. And what he had in mind, and what we continued to use those buildings for, which gave Prairie Grove a unique way of, which I think was even better in a lot of ways than some of the National Park Service sites had, in that we not only preserved the battle and told people how the battle developed and the result and, you know, all those kind of actions, but we also helped preserve how the war impacted the Ozarks and Ozark culture. You know, what was it like for the people who lived here during the Battle of Prairie Grove? You know, all of those kinds of things. And to a lot of people, that's a lot more interesting than just the military maneuverings and who the generals were and all those kind of actions. So it was just one more way to help people really get interested in the Battle of Prairie Grove and the big picture of what that did to the area. We had the first one of those in 1978, and it was a tiny little affair, and I don't even remember, there probably wasn't more than maybe 50 Civil War reenactors and a few horses, and tried to have another one the next year and the next year, and they were each getting a little bigger, and we were figuring out better ways to do it. There was one thing that we saw, though, was they were really hard to put on. First of all, because you got strangers coming in with horses, and you know, they're generally driven from where they worked and driven half the night and getting in the dark and trying to set it up and put on this big program on Saturday, which was just a nightmare, to tell you the truth about it. And so we decided pretty soon, hey, every other year is enough to do this. And so we started doing it every other year. But the area just had a hunger for watching those kind of things, and probably some of our biggest crowds were from the battle reenactment. And again, hard to put on, and it was from the Friday until they left on Sunday night. It was pretty much for the park staff and volunteers and everybody, pretty much just 20 around the clock work during all that time to keep that going. And we started limiting it to having 1,000 soldiers. That was kind of but that's a lot of people to come into an area and get organized and camp. And some of them have totally different ideas. You know, some of them are just, as someone said, they're just playing cowboys and Indians, and this is a place where adults can do that. But other ones were strict historians, wanting to do everything just right. And so we got to, you know, as the park staff, we had to manage those things and make them willing to play together, to do a program for the public so the public can see what it's like. And a lot of times it was not understood and not very accurate, but I do think it accomplished the thing in letting the public get just a tiny bit more of an idea of what a Civil War battle was probably like. You know, they get to hear the cannons go off, they get to see what it is to see, you know, 1,000 soldiers, even though there were 25,000 here. You know, they weren't all in one little wad, they were scattered out. And you know, Civil War battles were confusing. You know, it wasn't like there were radio communications. People got lost and pointed the wrong directions, and that's the kind of show that we put on. You know, there was a lot of confusion in it, but I think the public enjoyed it. And again, they focused in on, okay, that's the point. of Prairie Grove Battlefield State Park is they are trying to help people have an understanding of the Civil War. And you know, it's like everything else. Some people got it. Some people would really, you know, the light switch would go on, and just like it did for Civil War soldiers, you know. Some of them thought it was going to be fun and games, and they were wanting to get in their licks for their country and wanting to go out and fight somebody and shoot some Yankees or whatever. But after they got into a battle, I mean, we've got written testimony from them that it was such a horrible thing. You know, they never wanted to see a battle again. They saw what an awful thing it was, and that was part of what we tried to do with the reenactments and the programming that we did for school kids, was get them to see that of all the things humans do, war is probably the worst thing. That was a real exciting time, and it was pretty early here in my experiences at the park. I believe it was maybe 1981 when it happened. And you know, at that time, everybody just got excited for anything that was like Hollywood or a movie or anything. And we get this information that Columbia Pictures is interested in making a mini-series. And the only mini-series then that people had any memory about was Roots. And you know, it was just a huge success. And so here was going to be one about the Civil War. And I mean, everybody was exciting and promoting that. Some of the state park commissioners were actually wanting this so bad. You know, they were kind of promising, yeah, we'll do whatever it takes. You know, we want you to film this thing in Arkansas. And it was a big deal. It was a big financial deal. I was thinking about it, and I believe this is correct, that they were spending $50,000 a day, the CBS was, to film here. And so there's hundreds of stories, good and bad, that I could tell about the experience. But the thing that I think about most, on the crew, the movie making crew, there were 500 people. And I'm talking round figures, but there was about 500 involved in making the movie. And each day, especially the day when they were actually filming battle scenes, they would again have 1,000 or 1,500 reenactors here sometimes. And all of the trucks and the horses and the different things that went along with that on the park here. And I was the only park person, uniformed official here at the time to try to kind of have a little bit of control over that, and I didn't. And what I said about the movie people, and I don't mean to be insulting them, but they said whatever you wanted to hear, and then they did whatever they wanted to do, and then they tried to pay for the damages. Then was what I learned about the movie making business. So. But it was a lot of fun, and I think even the Hollywood people, the ones I talked to, they really liked coming here, because I guess it kind of quit being cool for a big star in California, you know, to get a lot of notice from the public and stuff like that. Well, huge crowds were showing up here to watch the Blue and the Gray. I mean, every day, especially, you know, when they were filming on a weekend or something. I mean, big crowds of people would come, and they'd be looking for the stars and pointing and everything. And they actually told me, some of them did, that they thought that was pretty neat, that they were just so much bigger than life here in Northwest Arkansas, where you know, they're not that way a lot of other places where they went. So it was a real memorable experience. And like you and I were talking about earlier, pretty much everybody in the area that wanted to be in it was in it. And you know, all of the big shots from around town were in it, and everybody, you know, if they wanted to be an extra or whatever, could have their chance to get in a major film. Oh, I would still say it is the most pretty much ideal place in the world to live, and as I was saying earlier about the kind of the flavor and the atmosphere that it had when I first moved here in '77, it's still got that today. And I know there are some of the older folks in town that want to keep that. And I'm hoping that we can, because first of all, it's ideally situated, just outside of growing, busy Northwest Arkansas. But when people come here and are interested in the town and do ask me about it, it's got a really good school, that I don't think can be surpassed anywhere, because it's got great people that work here. And they are people that mostly, I'd say, live in Prairie Grove. It's got great churches. The city is, I think, just the right mix of being progressive and yet holding on to family values and preservation. Downtown has got a lot of preservation, a lot of people preserving houses in the area. It's just a good place to raise a family. You just couldn't do any better than that. I told you I'd come to the Lions Club, and I met the Parks brothers, and who were synonymous with the Prairie Grove Telephone Company. And the Prairie Grove Telephone Company was, top notch. It was the technology and everything they have, it was far ahead of where we had come from in Russellville. And so even though we were in a tiny little town, it wasn't like it was, backwater place or anything. It was on top of things. And I think Prairie Grove has pretty much stayed that way. The services and everything that you get from the city here are really good. Everything from recycling to, it's just a nice, progressive town. I don't think you have to make any sacrifices. I have seen a lot of things develop since I was here, since I first came here. Got a Chamber of Commerce, and Prairie Grove developed an industrial park while I was here. And it was just, Prairie Grove has had really good leadership, I think. Some really good families that have worked on keeping the town moving, and they've made a lot of personal donations and sacrifices and investment in Prairie Grove that I think a lot of towns probably don't have that. So for some reason, I think Prairie Grove just had an overabundance of really good people. And I think, my family wanted to be part of that. That's part of the reason that, that we saw that from the start. These are good folks, and we wanted to stay here and be part of it.